Good afternoon, or of course, good morning or good evening, depending on where you are or when you're watching this. My name is Jay Shamba. I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, here at GW, and I'd like to welcome you virtually to Washington, D.C. So we here at IIEP are very pleased to be hosting this event on the distribution of wealth in Germany from 1895 to 2018 as part of our series, Facing Inequality. For those of you who don't know us, excuse me, IIEP is located at the Elliott School at GW and is a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary, and nonpartisan research on a range of policy issues surrounding economic globalization. That's a mandate we interpret rather broadly and support research and work on areas ranging from trade to international finance to development economics to poverty studies, climate change, inequality, and economic policy more broadly. And we've also had a focus on policy issues around China's economy and India's economy. We've been very busy at IIEP of late. Please look at our website to see upcoming events or a YouTube channel to see previous events that you may have missed. We have another installment of Facing Inequality coming up on February 28th with Trevon Logan discussing how economic history can inform our views on racial economic inequality in the United States. I'd like to acknowledge the IIEP Executive Circle for their support and welcome any members in attendance in as well. And now I'd like to briefly introduce today's event before turning it over to our speakers. So our Facing Inequality series aims to discuss inequality from a range of angles and disciplines. And so we try very hard to have this be an interdisciplinary talk whenever possible. And so generally our goal is to have discussants from a range of different disciplines. I think economic history in some sense always lends itself almost very directly to that sort of conversation, as historians and economists are both very active in the field and can learn a great deal from one another. So today our presentation is from Dr. Charlotte Bartels, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the German Institute for Economic Research, DIW. And for the academic year 2021-2022, she is a Kennedy Fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. She also contributes to the German series for the World Inequality Database. And we'll be hearing from her, as I mentioned, about the distribution of wealth in Germany over roughly the last century. We have two discussants. We have an economist, Alice Volz, who is a principal economist at the Federal Reserve Board. At the board, Alice works in the microeconomic surveys section, which oversees the surveys of consumer finance, and her research interests focus on inequality and retirement. And also with us, we have Trevor Jackson, who is an assistant professor of economic history at George Washington, where he teaches history of inequality and economic crises. He works on early modern European economic history, with an emphasis on inequality and financial crises. Trevor is an IIEP affiliate and also a co-organizer and founder of the Facing Inequality series here at GW. And so with that, I'd like to turn things over to Charlotte.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to present my work here in Washington today. So it's a joint paper with Thilo Albers from University of Berlin and Moritz Schulerich from the University of Bonn. And yeah, it's about the long-run evolution of wealth and its distribution in Germany. So our first motivating question is, of course, to understand the long-run series. How did wealth inequality in Germany evolve over the past 120 years? So the answer to this probably maybe simple question is actually not that simple, as you can also take from the US debate that is still unsettled about the levels and recent trends. So there are these contributions by Manuel Sells and Gabriel Zuckman, but also by Zidar, Smith and Zwick, and also by Alice and Jesse Bricker, coming to very different results. So these differences, we would argue, are due to a variety of wealth concepts that arise from using different data sources and methodologies, and the available data sources and the methodologies that come with these data sources greatly vary across country as well, which poses another challenge for researchers who want to then do international comparisons. Just to give you an example of the differences in estimates that you get in Germany by using different data. So the estimate for the wealth share owned by the top percentile in Germany ranges from 20% by using the survey data that we have without further adjustments, and then by adding some observations of rich wealth holders from the Forbes list or the Manager Magazine Rich list, and interpolating between these observations and the survey observations, this top 1% wealth share increases to about 30%. So this is just to give you an impression of the degree of insecurity that we're facing in that area. So this is a large part of the project, trying to find an estimate that we can rely on about the level and the trend of wealth inequality. And then in the second step, once we constructed the long run series that we could trust in, we asked ourselves, so what is now responsible for the changes that we observed looking at this long run series? There is increasing evidence for what is driving wealth inequality in recent decades, and it's mostly valuation changes. So housing booms that increase the value of the assets, of housing assets that are mostly held by the middle class, tend to reduce wealth inequality, while stock market booms, because wealth equity is mostly held by very rich individuals, tends to increase wealth concentration at the top. So this has been found for France, for the US, and for Spain for recent decades. But now that we have constructed this long run series, we ask ourselves, what are factors behind the large shocks that we saw in the first half of the 20th century, when we actually saw much more movement in wealth concentration if we compare it to recent decades? So is it the same factors behind these large shocks? Is it also asset prices that explain the decline in wealth concentration during the first half of the century, or is it something else? So our German series cover a lot of large shocks along different dimensions. It covers 3 currency conversions, hyperinflation, substantial border changes, war destruction, so destruction of capital, and also influx of refugees from the East after World War I and World War II, and a unification also in 1990 of 2 different forms of markets. So the biggest challenges, as I already mentioned up front, is for measuring wealth inequality that you have different data sources for different periods, and also different populations covered by the different data sources. So of course we have to balance our distributional information with macroeconomic aggregates. So we also consider national accounts, which often record the replacement value, which is not necessarily coinciding with the market value. So particularly for recent decade in Germany, where we saw rising housing prices, this is not captured very well by the national accounts value. So we replace actually their national accounts housing value. Then we have wealth tax data that often record cadastral values of real estate or unincorporated businesses. So we have to do some adjustments to wealth tax data in order to align these cadastral values and for certain asset types to market values. And survey data, of course, but we have to take this as given, relies on the respondent's estimate of market value that may differ from the true market value. But we won't do any adjustments to this third aspect. Then different populations are covered by different data sources. Of course, national accounts by definition include the whole resident population, while wealth tax data only include the rich part of the population that owns substantial wealth. So for most, the longest part of the period where we draw on wealth tax data, we can actually only compute the top 1% wealth share and not compute the Gini coefficient, because we only know the wealth of the very top. For more recent decades, we have survey data, but these survey data, particularly for Germany, are known to miss exactly the very rich. So we have to do some adjustments to at least add a little further information on very high wealth in recent decades where we don't have wealth tax data anymore, which was abolished in 1995 in Germany. So in our paper, we provide the first consistent long-run series of wealth and its distribution, and also investigate the drivers of wealth inequality. So for this, we first start to put together a large macroeconomic data set that reports the level and the structure of private household wealth since 1895. We are fortunate that we can build on previous work by Gabriel Zuckman and Thomas Piketty, who in turn greatly built on a dissertation of the 80s by an Austrian economist, and we extend and slightly adjust this series. And then we harmonize and combine the aggregate series with our distributional series, which we take from wealth tax data, from household survey data. There are 3 household surveys in Germany that record wealth, and also wealth rankings to adjust for the fact that these household surveys are known to miss the very rich. Then we can assess the distribution of wealth across German households in line with national accounts. So we upgrade all our survey and wealth tax data to match national accounts aggregates from industrialization periods until today. And finally, we construct some counterfactuals. So for the historical period, we construct historical counterfactuals. And for the more recent period, we also do some different counterfactual approaches, like a reweighting method to understand the drivers of wealth inequality over time. As I said before, we use wealth tax data for most of the period for our distribution, and for the recent period, for the recent decades, we also use survey data complemented with rich lists. For the aggregate, we draw on a variety of data sources ranging from wealth tax to contemporary estimates, statistical yearbooks, and in more recent periods, of course, we take the official figures provided by the central bank and the statistical office of Germany. But we also do some adjustments to the recent period using tax data. The definition of wealth throughout the paper will be the value of assets owned by households, net of debt. So we include financial assets such as savings deposits or life insurances, real assets such as houses and farmland, and also business assets, which are really important in Germany, as only a small fraction of firms is actually listed at the stock exchange, and most are closely held family firms. Importantly, we also have used the concept of marketable wealth. So this means that we do not include social security pensions. I totally agree that that would be really nice to see as well, particularly in a country like Germany that has a very large share of social security pensions receiving population. There are cross-sectional estimates that the Gini would be substantially lower if we would include social security pensions, but this is only done for one particular year, and it would be a separate paper to do that for the historical period. So in the aggregate, we of course come up with a new aggregate wealth estimate, which then also gives us a new wealth income ratio. Just to compare that with the previous wealth income ratio constructed by Piketty and Zuckman in 2014, we do a small downward revision of total wealth in the early 20th century, slightly, particularly revising downwards the valuation of land. And we do an upward adjustment for real estate and business assets in the post-war period, because business assets particularly are very undervalued in official national accounts. And also the European Central Bank state that officially, but until now they haven't agreed on an approach to deal with that differently. So we introduce a new approach to use basically what the US Fed is doing, to use price earnings ratios and income tax data to then impute a different measure of wealth held by these unincorporated businesses. The composition of wealth has greatly changed over time. Most importantly, the role of financial assets basically collapsed for the first time after World War II, and then again after World War I, which is to one extent due to the collapse of equity prices, which happened in many countries in the first half of the 20th century, but then also due to hyperinflation and the currency form that was followed by it, which basically eradicated savings after World War II and after World War I, and after World War II, we had another currency conversion, which again almost eradicated savings deposits. In the post-war period, you can then observe the gradual expansion of real estate, which is also an international phenomenon and observed in other countries. So the share of real estate today now is much higher than it used to be in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is if you want to understand how this aggregate wealth changed over time, it's really about equity prices going down, which reduce the role of financial assets, and savings deposits going down because of currency reforms, basically taking away 90% of the value of savings deposits twice, after World War I and after World War II. And the lost territory after World War II in Germany was basically compensated by an increase in agricultural prices for agricultural land for the remaining territory of Germany. But this is not the main focus of the paper. We want to rather look more into detail of the distribution of wealth and not so much into the aggregate. So we have these tables that, this is just an exemplary table of the source of the distribution that we have available for most of the period, which lists the number of taxpayers and their aggregate amount of wealth for different wealth brackets, which we can then use to estimate via Pareto interpolation the wealth share of the top percentile of the wealth distribution. For the more recent period, we have survey data that we then importantly top correct with wealth rankings and also uprate to match macroeconomic aggregates. And we do some adjustment to the official aggregates for real estate and business wealth because they're known to underestimate aggregate wealth. And importantly to note, this uprating is not universally increasing wealth concentration, because not only is business wealth underrepresented in survey data so that we underestimate wealth of the very rich who own these businesses, it's also the fact that current accounts and savings seems to be underestimated in surveys. So people tend to forget about their current account when they report their financial assets and surveys, so that broadly only half of all financial assets and savings accounts and current accounts are captured by surveys, which is then, and as savings and current accounts are held by the broad population, we also increase their wealth by uprating their wealth to national accounts. And then we use a generalized Pareto interpolation to estimate the wealth shares and the Gini coefficient. To give you an impression of the impact of our uprating and top correcting procedure on the different survey data, we list here the wealth of the different percentiles. So if you look at the median, the 50th percentile, you see that it increases from about 60,000 euros across different surveys to more than 120 basically if we uprate and top correct their wealth, because, as I said earlier, of the underrepresentation of savings deposits and current accounts in surveys. But a much bigger effect is, of course, observable at the very top of the distribution. The threshold of the top 0.01% is about 12 million or even only 5 million if we look at unadjusted survey data. And this then increases to about 90 million if we do our uprating and top correction procedure, which then matches the 100 million minimum wealth of the poorest member of the Manager Magazine Rich List, which is basically the top 0.01% of the wealth distribution in Germany. So this makes us confident that this method actually works pretty well. This is the first figure of results, and our most important figure. It depicts the long run evolution of the top 1% wealth share from 1895 to 2018. And what I want you to mostly take away from this picture is that almost half of the wealth was owned by just 1% in the beginning of the 20th century. And during industrialization period, this then already declined after World War I and hyperinflation. After the Great Depression, it declined once again, and then again declined after World War II. And after World War II, it has oscillated around the level of 25%, but not in historical comparison, we don't see a lot of movement since World War II. If you want and start to look at the series up from 1990, when Germany was unified, you see a small increase, but it appears moderate if we compare to the levels that we've seen in during the industrialization period. So is Germany now an exceptional case, or how does it compare to other countries? Here we also display the series of the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Sweden, which are all available on the World Inequality Database. And you see that Germany is in fact moving quite in line with these other countries. High levels of wealth concentration were also observed in these other countries. And depending on the series, you see more up and down movements, but generally, most of the decline happened before 1950. And in most countries, we only see a moderate increase in maybe since the 1980s, 1990s. And yeah, United States kind of stands out with the most marked increase. But here I show the series of Gabriel Zuckman and Emmanuel Saez. And yeah, I guess Alice will say something about this maybe in her discussion. But if you want, I think what is interesting to highlight in the European perspective, Germany used to be among the countries with a comparably low wealth concentration during industrialization period, and now ranks highest in terms of top 1% wealth share. So what can we now learn from the German example as a pars pro toto for these large decline that we observed in wealth concentration in the first half of the 20th century? For this, we construct different historical counterfactuals, taking a base year for a certain event and then letting this event happen in the space year instead of the true year. So for example, we take as a base year for hyperinflation 1913 and then pretend as if hyperinflation would have happened on the distribution in 1913 to isolate the effect that the hyperinflation had on the distribution. For this, then we have to carefully research what actually happened through the hyperinflation and then construct counterfactual total wealth and counterfactual population for the different events that we investigate, and also understand how ranking of wealth holders might change given the nature of the counterfactual, the event that we look at. And then we calculate the difference between the observed top percentile share and the counterfactual top percentile share to calculate the partial effect of the event. For example, we look at the border changes after World War I, and for this we take the distribution of 1913 and pretend as if we would measure wealth inequality within the borders of the post-war, of the interwar era, because we have all regional wealth statistics available, so we can easily construct a distribution of wealth within the Weimar borders and then calculate the counterfactual wealth share and then compute the difference between that. Similarly, we can also do that for hyperinflation, which was mostly an asset price shock. And we can then simulate this asset price shock on the wealth distribution of 1913 and see that counterfactually, the wealth concentration with hyperinflation happening in 1913 would have created a lower top wealth share of only 42%, and so that hyperinflation has reduced wealth concentration by about 2.4%. This figure summarizes all of our findings for the different events that we look at. So we look at changing asset prices through hyperinflation, We look at territorial changes after the war. We look at refugees, fallen soldiers in World War I, World War II, bankruptcies after the Great Depression, destruction after World War II, or during World War II, asset seizures after World War II, several wealth levies in place before and after World War II, the biggest of them being the Lastenausgleich to compensate for losses of part of the German population that lost their wealth in the lost territories, which was enacted in 1952, and of course also at the persecution of the Jews. And what I want to highlight here is that asset prices were really important to reduce wealth concentration after World War II and the hyperinflation, and also after the Great Depression. And after World War II, it really seems to have worked through the destruction of assets that took away a lot of wealth, and also wealth levies. So one should say that this wealth levy put in place in 1952 was 50%, so half of business assets and real estate was taxed away. But this tax could be paid in quarterly installments until the 1970s. So it did not reduce current wealth immediately, but we can simulate what would have happened to the wealth distribution if it wouldn't have been paid, because we observe the levels that were determined to be paid in the 1952 distribution. So I'm also often asked what happened through unification, and why don't we see a larger rupture after unification in 1990, as this brought together a socialist economy with a capitalist economy. And this is, one should say that actually the East German population had substantial savings because consumption possibilities were limited, and there was a fixed interest rate on savings deposits, and also 25% of the population owned their single family houses. So they didn't enter the wealth distribution with no wealth at all, but they were of course much poorer than the West German population. And what happens through unification is that at the first hand, total wealth increases by about 8%, which you see on the left hand of the left graph. But then also some West German people who not used to be in the top 1% group move up into this now enlarged top 1% group, because adding 20% to the population also enlarges the group of the top 1%. So by this, the aggregate wealth of the top 1% group also increases, and this is a much higher increase because these West German top 1% wealth holders are so much richer than the East Germans that enter the distribution from below, that this wealth increase is higher. And as a total effect of unification computed on the survey that we have in 1993, where we can observe the distribution of wealth in both population types, the top 1% share increases by about 10%. So this is just to show that there are different mechanisms in place, and it's not so clear-cut how unification affected inequality, but we can see here, if we just look at the top 1% wealth share, unification slightly increased wealth concentration mostly by moving up richer West German individuals into this now enlarged top 1% group. So, long run conclusion of our wealth inequality paper is that wealth concentration in Germany used to be very high during industrialization, when the top 1% captured almost half of total wealth. The two world wars and hyperinflation then greatly equalized the wealth distribution. And in recent decades, we see a comparatively small, but we do see a wealth inequality increase. Our counterfactual approach has shown that asset prices do account for most of the inequality decline following World War I, hyperinflation, and the Great Depression. But after World War II, it was really wealth levies and war destruction that drove the decline of wealth concentration at the top. For the more recent decades, we can construct wealth inequality across the, or investigate wealth inequality across the whole distribution. So we can compute a Gini coefficient, we can compute the wealth share of the bottom 50. And what I want to draw your attention to in this figure is that the share of the bottom half is very small in Germany as in other countries as well. So half of the population used to own less than 5% in the beginning of the 90s, which then halved to less than 3% in 2018. The middle class, if you want to define the middle 40% of the wealth distribution as the middle class, their share is largely stable, and this the top percentile's wealth share increased. To understand what is behind the recent dynamics, we start with constructing wealth portfolios across the wealth distribution. And on the left hand, you see the wealth portfolio of the bottom 50% of the German wealth distribution. And you see that housing is of very small importance for the bottom 50% in Germany. The housing owning share is less than 50%. So roughly speaking, only the upper half of the wealth distribution in Germany owns houses, and the bottom 50% is mostly invested in deposits and other financial assets like life insurances. And what is also important to note here, that in real terms, their wealth remained roughly stable. So they had 20,000 euros on average in the beginning of the 90s, and they do have the same amount in 2018 in real terms. For the middle 40%, you see that housing is their predominant asset, and this increased after 2008. In 2011, house prices in Germany started to increase and are still on the rise. The middle 40% pretty much look like the next 9%, who are also mostly invested in housing, and only the top percentile in Germany owns substantial amounts of business wealth and equity, which is included in the measure of business wealth here. So now we can use these portfolios to simulate what fraction of wealth growth at the different points of the wealth distribution arises from changing in prices, so from capital gains on housing or stocks. And stocks include unincorporated businesses here as well, because we evaluate them according to stock price evolutions as well. So if we look at the long time period from 1993 to 2018, we see that stock prices are really the most important driver compared to housing prices for wealth growth, particularly for the top percentile. And house prices only play a substantial role if we zoom into the most recent decade, where we actually saw an increase in house prices. So I should add that in the 90s until 2010, house prices in real terms actually declined in Germany. So only recently it has surpassed in real terms the levels of house price that we've seen in the 90s. But what I also want to highlight here is this gray area, the kind of the residual, what is called synthetic savings in the literature. And this in the German case, it is important to see that the gray area is pretty large for the middle class and the next middle 40% and the next 9%. So savings of the middle class compensates for the capital gains that the top 1% obtains from stocks. So the fact that German middle classes still save so much moderates differences in wealth growth across the percentiles of the wealth distribution, and compensates them for missing out on capital gains from the stock market. In international comparison, the middle class savings is also high. So if we compare the savings rate that is implicit by the graph that I showed before in Germany in red to other countries like France or the United States, we see that middle class savings rate is much higher in Germany than in these other countries. And we can also reconcile the differences in wealth savings rates across the wealth distribution using savings that are directly observed in survey data. So we can either construct a savings measure of using the difference between disposable income and consumption from the EVS survey, And we can also use savings that are directly asked for in the sub-survey data, which also includes the mortgage repayments. And we want to highlight here, there's an ongoing discussion in macroeconomics to what extent savings rates are flat across the wealth distribution, or if they do increase, that not only the synthetic savings rates that I've shown you before saw an increase, but also different measures of savings rates from different survey data show that the rich people save a larger fraction of their disposable income than the poor people. And often it is said that, well, we shouldn't maybe not worry about the bottom 50% from a life cycle perspective, because this is mostly young people who eventually move out of the bottom 50% once they enter the labor market and accumulate some savings over their life cycle. But in Germany, almost half of the bottom 50% is older than 50 years. So it's not that they will ever leave the bottom 50% over their life cycle. So we find a limited role for wealth mobility over the life cycle. And also, it is often argued that maybe it's just the increased number of single households that is behind the wealth growth changes that we observe. So if we look at if households split into two households and form two single households, of course their wealth is lower. So we do a counterfactual exercise using the Dinado et al. Reweighting method and compute wealth growth, assuming the same household and age structure in 2018 as in 1993, and we see that our wealth growth patterns only slightly changes. So the bottom 50% would have had slightly higher wealth growth if we still would have the household size and age structure of 1993, but still we see this large discrepancy between the wealth growth of the bottom half of the wealth distribution at the upper half of the wealth distribution. Concluding for our whole picture, we saw that wealth concentration in Germany and in other countries measured by the top 1% wealth share halved between 1900 and 1950. And since unification in Germany, we see a widening gap between the lower half of the wealth distribution that basically does not own houses and stocks, and the upper half of the wealth distribution that does. So rising real estate prices since 2011 and also large savings of the middle class have moderated wealth inequality in Germany in recent years. But in generally, asset prices seem to be central for changes in the wealth distribution across the 20th century. And also particularly for the wealth concentration at the top. So if we want to understand how wealth concentration changes over time, it's much more about asset prices than about savings. But if we look at the aggregate, and particularly at the wealth of the lower classes, or also to some extent at the middle classes, savings become important to compensate for the missing capital gains, as they do not own houses or stocks where they could benefit from capital gains. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thanks very much. That was a fascinating tour of both the measurement issues and some kind of broad facts about what's going on there. So I'd like to turn it straight over to our discussants, starting with Alice Falls. And just to remind our audience that the Q&A is open. If you want to start populating it with questions after the discussants, I'll bring those questions forward to the group. So Alice, please.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for inviting me to discuss Charlotte and her co-authors' papers. Standard Fed disclaimer that these are my opinions and they don't represent anyone at the Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve System. So as Jay mentioned, so I'm an economist, and so I'm going to focus kind of on what is my comparative advantage in reading Charlotte and her co-authors' paper. My first main takeaway is that the amount of work and what the Charlotte and her co-authors have done is so impressive to me. What they've put together and what they've been able to kind of dig up and learn about the evolution of wealth inequality. They've contributed some new aggregates for both housing and business wealth, both sort of historically, but also in the current time period, and their accounting framework to look at how shocks to wealth over history has changed our measures of inequality. And then for more recent, they've tried to map together different surveys that might contain information that's useful for one piece of the wealth concept versus another. So I'm going to, because I work, as Charlotte kind of alluded to, I work with the Survey of Consumer Finances, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about kind of household measurement, and both on the survey side and in aggregate. So that's where I'm going to focus my attention. So I was almost as excited to read the appendix of their paper that as I was the main paper, because there's a lot to be learned in there. So I'm going to be in the weeds maybe a little bit more than some of you might have been. But I think that, you know, when we're talking about measuring wealth and wealth inequality, you know, the measurement of some of the big pieces that contribute to the wealthy households' holdings is really crucial to what our takeaways are in terms of the level and the evolution of inequality. So I'm going to start with business wealth and spend most of my time there, since that's an area that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in the past few years. So I think, first of all, for exposition, at least for the modern period, maybe historical, but again, I am not the expert there, I would separate out kind of corporate holdings from non-corporate holdings, because the measurement and the challenges there are very different, especially, you know, as the current period, it's easy to think about how much a stock is worth and how many you hold. And then that's a lot different than valuing a private business. So I think that that distinction is important when we're trying to interpret the results. And so they make some assumptions about how to estimate aggregate business wealth depending on the type of data that they have in hand. And so they bring to bear sort of the household balance sheets that kind of part of the financial accounts is the way I think of it in Germany. They have their estimates, and the authors take issue with that there's undercounting going on. But they keep some, I think I would have liked a little bit more discussion, even if it was in the appendix, about kind of if some estimates are being used by the authors and others aren't, what was the decision making going into that choice, right? So what they've done is they've kept the household balance sheet estimates of kind of the smaller firms, not necessarily family firms, because there's some very big successful family firms in Germany that fall into the sort of quasi-corporation category. But I think just a little bit more discussion there about who is getting the business wealth matters. So again, a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's really important when we're thinking about how to estimate aggregate business wealth. So they're using two different liquidity discounts for private companies. This has become kind of a little bit more well understood, that they treat the two different types of firms, they do it differently. And so I would like a little bit more discussion about that choice. I think that there is some rationale for treating kind of bigger private firms different than maybe middle-sized firms. But again, a little bit more explanation into how that choice was made. And then they're using price to earnings ratios to kind of map between business profits and business wealth. The financial accounts, so far as I understand it, when they're estimating private C and S corporation wealth, they're using an industry-specific multiple from public firms. And so I think that this dimension is really important. And I'm not sure, again, what's available for the authors. So I don't want to say go do this if you can't do it. But if you can't, get industry level earnings to provide that blow up factor in a sense, then maybe trying to think about if the price earnings ratio from the public firms might be a sort of an overstatement or understatement if we can think about comparing the industry composition between private and public firms. And then, as I mentioned, the choice of liquidity discounts, there's a recent update from when Smith, Zadar, and Zwick's paper that they updated an earlier study that tries to map private firm sales to public, and their estimate from US data is about 10%, but it does matter depend on which concept of profit you're using. And so the last piece that's again up for a lot of debate these days is how much of business profits reflect capital income versus labor income. And so I wonder if the authors have thought about that or making adjustments on that margin to maybe shave off the labor share so that when they're estimating business wealth, that it's mostly reflecting business capital and not the labor provided by the owners. Okay, so I think I want to spend time thinking about, we know that business wealth is a key driver of wealth growth. In Germany, their housing is important as well. But I want to understand the trend a little bit better. And so, when there's differences between the author's new estimates and even the household balance sheets, understanding those differences so we feel more confident in what the authors are bringing to bear would be helpful. So one thought is to think about how aggregate business income is related to the household balance sheets, and again and maybe even the author's estimates, and because this is underlying some of the capitalization research to estimate wealth in the United States and other countries, right? And so could the authors estimate or business wealth for the small firms that they don't which they don't currently do, right? And so that would sort of you'd have to look a little bit more at what the survey says in terms of business income, kind of compared to the tax data to feel if that's something you'd be confident in the survey-based estimates. Or would you want to use the tax data if you have more individual level data to kind of map that onto a survey instead of using, right now they're mapping two surveys together, which is a transition to my next slide. So they are using two different household surveys. One is sort of their baseline, which is the EVS, for their kind of quote unquote modern estimates of wealth inequality, but the EVS doesn't contain my understanding. Again, if I get some of the specifics wrong, I might have missed something in the paper or appendix, but the EVS doesn't contain business wealth estimates for the household, but another survey that SOEP does. And so they're mapping between the two surveys. So I, being a survey person, would like to know more about how that match is created. And the one thing that kind of caught my eye, and Charlotte did show it, I think, but sort of that the SOP contour of business assets does look different over the past couple decades compared to all other sources, whether it be the balance sheets or the Piketty-Sayas estimates from 2014. So just sort of thinking about, what's underlying that again. And then the authors do discuss, they have a couple points where they are making kind of conservative assumptions or choices, right? So, and I completely appreciate this. Instead of making an aggressive assumption, start with the conservative benchmark. But I think that trying to think about what other assumptions could they be making to allocate business wealth across households, and would that change their conclusions? And same thing, they could do different choice of liquidity discount for different firms, or maybe across time, because there's some evidence that the liquidity discount has gotten smaller. Could that change what they're find as well? So I know that I'm almost at 10 minutes, so I'm going to skip around a little bit. So the one of, I think that I do appreciate sort of the trying to decompose the role of asset prices from active savings, especially in a country like Germany, where there's a lot of active savings going on, even among middle-class households. But I would want a little bit more discussion about what are the underlying trends, demographic trends that could make their conclusions a little bit, some stronger than others. I think I would just be a little bit more careful or get into the weeds a little bit more about that and what assumptions they need to make, and think about, who in each of these groups is gaining the gains from capital gains and who is doing the savings, right? So if I'm thinking about the bottom 50, and I I appreciate that there is definitely less maybe movement in and out of that group compared to other countries, right? But if who's getting the who's doing the active savings at that point, right? If you have your people in your 50s, they may still be doing a lot of active savings, and someone in their 30s wouldn't be contributing that. So as the demographic trends have changed even for that group, right? Charlotte showed that that their average wealth is about the same as now as it was 30 years ago, but they also over the same period they saw a decline in the number of young households and an increase. So that there's sort of other things going on in the intervening, over the 30 years, that there could be some discussion sort of different trends and how each of those factors could affect sort of the conclusions. And then finally, I don't know if this is as important in Germany as it is in the United States, but paper from a couple of years ago by some Fed co-authors showed that when you're decomposing kind of changes in aggregate wealth over time, absolutely capital gains is most of it in the United States, but that transfers and inheritances is a really big piece as well. And so if wondering if that, because savings is the residual in the current exercise, if transfers between households would be part of that as well. And so I think I like the conservative nature, but I think that trying to account for how much the assumptions you make are affecting your takeaway message is important. And then I think a little bit more discussion of sort of the surveys and how they're, what do we think that there's some shortfalls that we want to think about. So the last thing I actually want to say is that there's a recent effort from the European Central Bank and the HFCN, which is the Household Finance Consumption Network, which produces a similar household level survey to the Survey of Consumer Finances and is implemented by the varying central banks across Europe. They also have a recent effort to try and do something similar to what Charlotte and her co-authors are doing, but using the HFCN data for Germany as its base. And there's very different motivation, but they're doing a similar where they are scaling up to aggregate. So I think that a comparison with their estimates for Germany, which again, different surveys, different methodology, but they do find a little bit higher top 1% share than this study, but they do spend a lot of time trying to think about the gap between the survey estimate and the national account aggregate and how that gap should be allocated across households. So I just think sort of that would be a nice way to sort of think about putting it in context and understanding the differences there as well. And so since I've taken up plenty of time, I would like to say thank you. And this is really interesting, and I'm really glad I got the chance to spend a lot of time reading it. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you. Those were terrific comments. I want to turn it straight over to Trevor Jackson for his comments, and then to just once again remind people, if you've got questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I'll bring those to the panel after Trevor's discussion. Trevor, go ahead.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Charlotte, for that excellent paper, and Alice for those extremely detailed remarks. I'm the historian, and I assumed that my comparative advantage would not be about measurement or surveys. I wouldn't be able to compete with Alice on that, and that was definitely true. So I'm going to try to focus my questions more on concepts and interventions. And I just want to start by congratulating you, Charlotte, and your co-authors on this paper. I think it's truly remarkable. And every year when I teach my class on the history of inequality, I get students asking for this exact research. And every year I tell them, it'll never be done. It's just impossible. There are too many shocks, too many changes. All of the problems about identification are too difficult. No one will solve it. And you've done it. So congratulations on that. So my first question is that, I mean, as I'm sure you know, but perhaps the audience doesn't, where a lot of the action is at the moment in the literature on long run inequality is using the idea of the extraction ratio that we get from Milanovic, Lindert, and Williamson, which is trying to replace the Gini coefficient with something that's maybe more realistic to exist in the world, and in that way get behind what looks like continuity across big aggregates of distributions and see instead that there might be different kinds of changes. And so, you know, one of the striking things about your paper is how sometimes it seems like we're seeing real continuity. From like 1950 to 2018, there's a lot of continuity across pretty substantial changes in political regimes. And so I wondered if you thought about using something like an extraction ratio or engaging that kind of literature as a way of getting at what might otherwise be hidden variations. And so then on the subject of continuity and change, you gave a bit of evidence towards the end about limits to social mobility. And that made me think of a previous talk that we had in the spring by Neil Cummins, the LSE, who's done a couple of recent papers on the British wealth holdings. And his big interventions there are sort of to say, across a very long span of time, I think he goes well back into the 19th century, there's basically all of the changes in wealth holding distribution we see are in the top 30%. And he has this sort of terrifying sentence about how across all of the change, the median person in Britain died with nothing, that no amount of wealth concentration, distribution, redistribution ever touched the median. And it seems like a lot of your evidence as well speaks to maybe the top 40% being where the action is rather than at the median. And his second intervention along those lines is when he's tried to reconstruct what he calls dynasties and just try to say that the top 1% of British wealth holders are pretty much the same families across 150 years. And what he means those interventions together to say is that Britain was pretty unusual in having stability at the top of the social ladder. Well, Germany, I would think, is an extremely different case. But it seems like, you know, here we as well have a story that maybe doesn't touch the median. I wonder if you have, particularly from these rich lists that you mentioned, some sense of whether the composition of the top 1% changes across time. Are these basically the same people? Are they entirely different people under the Kaiserreich as opposed to under the Nazis as opposed to after the war? Do we see churn there? Can we tell? Moving on from that, I mean, there was one point of the periodization that I was surprised about, which is that you allude towards the end to the kind of international patterns that we see of the return of inequality since the 1970s. But it seems like Germany there is an exception, that we don't really get the substantial or any kind of return of inequality until after unification in the 1990s. And I just wondered if you could expand a bit more on why that's the case, given that in the paper you point to these kind of international dynamics that might have driven that, you know, across countries. Why is Germany different in that case? And then finally, you know, I'm going to be the historian and ask you the political question. I imagine that writing about 20th century Germany, you get political questions. But one of the common arguments that I encounter in the economic history of long and inequality, maybe expressed most forcefully by Walter Scheidel, is the idea that although inequality is bad, the very few occasions that we see of substantial reductions in inequality are worse. You know, that they correspond to the Black Death, the Russian Revolution, 1914 to 1945. And on the one hand, it does seem like that's the story you're telling. On the other hand, as you conclude, it seems like the big shifts are accounted for much more by asset prices, financial events that are probably well more within the realm of human agency or government policy, things that could be enacted with, you know, less terrible consequences than Scheidel seems to think. Is that part of the story? Should we think of the post-war wealth tax as part of the big takeaway? You know, how much is that a political choice? How much is the politics endogenous to the story that you're telling or exogenous to it? And how should I teach that next year when I teach this paper to my undergrads? So those are the things that come to mind. I hope that's in some way intelligible and complementary to what Alice had to say. So I'll turn it over to you, and then I think we'll take questions.
Great. Why don't we start? Charlotte, if you've got any responses you want to make to either Alice or Trevor, and then we can shift over to questions.
Yeah, thank you both so much for this incredibly valuable discussions. Alice, I will of course ask you to please send me your slides so that I can go through them and try to come up with all sorts of new figures to address these. So I think that was really helpful to understand what is important, to go more into detail from the current version that you saw now. That's really helpful to get your valuable view on what is important and what we could add as additional highlights. It's also very important for me to hear what you found good and convincing, and what you might find that, like the sub business assets matching procedure, that it wasn't clear to you. That's really helpful for me. I will look at it again and change that. Yeah, Trevor, thank you so much for your thoughts and questions. Actually, I've not thought at all about the extraction ratio of Mihailovic in our context. I will do so, I promise. I would not think that there is some hidden variation after 1950. I think we have pretty stable society since then, and not major changes. What brings me to your next question about Neil Cummins' work and changes in being maybe concentrated at the top of the distribution. So, well, we have very limited data on basically all of who did not belong to the top decile. So that's really the basic problem that we have in coming up with such long run stories. But of course, I've also thought about this question for a long time, and I've looked there's a rich list from 1913, and there is several German teams working with that, one in Mannheim, trying to match that with the most recent rich list, and then to highlight the share of people you find there that you already found in 1913. And it's, I would say, very interesting to look at that, how this differs across industry and regions. So if I look at the Hamburg rich list, where I grew up, so I know some of the families, it's pretty surprisingly that stable. So you see families on that rich list in 1913 owning private banks or shipping companies that are still rich and are still known in town. But of course, in Berlin, it's nothing. Has nothing to do with what we see today, because the emperor family is not anymore in Berlin. A lot of Jewish industrial families have left the country, and yeah, there is, I would say, both in Germany. We both have surprising stability given the turbulences that we've seen, but we also see a lot of new families that were able to build their fortune exactly through the wars. So some of the rich families like Oetker or BMW, the owning family, they started out selling some product to the military, like clothing or food or even weapons, building up fortunes through the war, and then they kind of washed it by buying BMW after the war. And now they're the nice family that produces our nice cars. So yeah, I think we have this both phenomena, but I wouldn't be able, and I think it's basically impossible statistically to quantify which is more important. But it's definitely something worthwhile. Maybe someone will come up with a method in the future to statistically, neatly identify how you can possibly say something with these limited information that we have, because we don't know anything about what happened to the people that are not in the rich list, right? And so how can we then construct intervals of confidence? So regarding your question, if Germany is an exception in not returning to higher levels of inequality, I would rather say that maybe the US is the exception. So in Germany and in other European countries, we see this moderate increase, but not this sharp increase that we see in the US. And I know, sure, that there's limited number of studies around, so I cannot produce this comparison graphs for a lot of countries. But I feel that maybe, yeah, it's the US that that is the exception in this case, and it's maybe because of the missing savings of the middle classes. So in Germany, we see a pretty stable income share of the middle class, which then is enabling them to still buy houses and repay their mortgages. So that's really the mechanism that is behind these savings that we see. The Germans are really conservative in their wealth accumulation behavior. They buy a house between 30 and 45, so half of the population does, and then they repay their debt until retirement, and then they live off with their social security pension without paying rent until they die. And this has basically not changed drastically. We see a small change that slightly less households buy houses these days, but not radical ruptures. And I feel, yeah, it's interesting to look at the US because it's just so different from what we see in France and in Germany, and also to the UK, I would say. I have to admit that I still did not read Walter Scheidel's book, even though I know that it's in my office and I have to do it. So maybe you can also quickly reply on what he says, what is behind the wars. So I know that his main hypothesis that it is wars. And our question was really to understand, yeah, war is a big concept, but what is really happening through this war? And hyperinflation in Germany, we cannot look at that and say that this is an event that is completely independent of the war. It is a consequence of the war. And inflation in UK and France also happened, not in a single year like in Germany, but also gradually starting during World War I. So this seems to be a universal phenomenon that World War I contributed to inflation, also World War II. And I would not try to engage in a discussion about exogeneity and endogeneity at this point. I would say basically everything is endogenous in this context, and our approach was we wanted to try to isolate some of the factor in a ceteris paribus setting without saying that anything is exogenous or here in that setting. Yeah, but we really wanted to understand what comes with the war. So the levy is, of course, the wealth levy is a consequence of the war, and this was also an international phenomenon. So Italy also discussed wealth levies, and also several countries like France and Spain, I think, discussed wealth levies already after World War I. So this seems to be also something that is related to these two world wars that we saw in the 20th century. And there's this book by Steve and Stafsowicz, who also claim that wars and taxation is really closely related. Yeah, but I definitely should look into Walter Scheidel's argument in more detail to relate this also to our study. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. I want to, again, encourage people to go ahead and post questions, but I have a few largely based off what all three of you have said so far. So one that I did want to come back to, especially given the conversation you're just having about limits to social mobility and whether the same families are staying there, is to bring back Alice's question about to what extent might inheritances really be driving a lot of things here, especially if I understood the point that the inheritances might show up as in what's called savings. And so to what extent do we want to think that it's not really just savings, it's also inheritances, which obviously came from someone's savings or something there. But and whether it's a case where the inheritances are going to be larger at the top and therefore pushing inequality, or if actually you're seeing substantial enough inheritances in the middle that it could be preventing a big spike in inequality.
Thank you very much, Jay, for coming back to that question. So it's really intensely discussed right now. I think. So Sandra Black from Columbia has this new paper where she and others investigate the share of inheritances in the total income flow over the life cycle, and then they find that apparently it's not such a big deal if you compare it to all your earnings. So I think the tricky thing about this question is always how you look at it. There is also a variety of studies that just add inheritances to the wealth distribution and then compute the Gini again, and then it equalizes the Gini coefficient. So then they conclude, well, it's not important for wealth inequality after all. But then there are also new studies by David Zeim and a co-author from Stockholm, and they show that they are very differently treated inheritances. So if they arrive for top wealth individuals, they probably grow over time, the inheritances, and they are more likely to be consumed if they are received by people below in the wealth distribution. So I have several ongoing projects where we investigate the impact of inheritances in Germany on individual wealth accumulation, and we find that they do have a strong effect. And probably this effect will increase even more in the future, given that, so for example, so 20% of the German population from East Germany will not receive any inheritances or very small inheritances, mostly only savings, which don't bring a lot of, they don't have capital gains. And those people whose parents bought houses in Cologne or Frankfurt or Munich or Hamburg, they have substantial capital gains in the past decades. So I think this impact will grow over time. And but it's important to understand how we can investigate that. So we do in a paper where we also investigate the different impact of regional economic growth on individual wealth. We find that if your birth town has higher economic growth rates, you will also have higher wealth. And then we can see that this is operating through inheritances. So your parents give you a higher amount of wealth because they earned more and probably also had higher house price increases in this higher wealth, higher growing towns where they lived. So yeah, I do think that this is an important mechanism, but it's very difficult to come up with a straight answer because it's not quite settled in the literature until now how to look at it. So it's kind of easy, I think, to confuse issues. I saw that on Twitter when the paper by Sandra Black and co-authors was discussed, that the people didn't understand that it was total inflows that they looked at, and total inflows is also needed to finance your consumption, your expenditures on rent, and of course it seems low over the life cycle on average what people receive as an inheritance. But this is maybe not what we were actually thinking about when we discussed that, because we think that inheritance will enable a person to buy a house or not. So a person who will never inherit something will probably never buy a house for most cases, because this is increasing your down payment by so much. And I think this is really the question that we're after when we're discussing that, but it's not always the framework that the researchers look at.
Thanks. And I should add here, if Trevor or Alice, if you at any point want to hop in with additional comments, please just, hop in.
I'll hop in real fast, just following up on one of Charlotte's responses to Trevor. So I think that putting the United States in the context, so I'm not even getting into the exact estimates, and I know why you present the size and Zuckman long run series, but I think that maybe the increase there is, maybe that is the outlier, but maybe the true increase, maybe it's not quite as drastic as it looks when you present it. But I also think the one thing to take in that also is different in the United States context compared to a lot of European countries is the retirement system. And so on the household balance sheets, you're going to get retirement wealth that's held at the household level and is going to be measured by surveys or by the financial accounts in whether it's in a kind of a defined contribution setup or even a defined benefit. But again, while the defined benefit's more equalizing, still most of those assets are sitting up at the top of the distribution. So yes, retirement's held more broadly across the population, just like housing, but it is very concentrated. So I think that that's one thing to take into account when we're comparing across countries, that the retirement assets besides housing, like that's what is the reason the middle class is saving, because they need to fund their retirement consumption, and whatever pensions and social security they have is not sufficient. So this is one thing, kind of to put things in context.
That actually leads to another question I had, which really is for I guess first for Charlotte, but for any of you, which is, when thinking about these broad historical studies around inequality, is how to think about access to retirement, not necessarily retirement accounts, but to retirement flows that are coming towards you in the form of Social Security and things like that. I know, Charlotte, you mentioned at the start that this is something that's not in the work currently, but I guess I'm curious how you think of it, that obviously if a society chose to do a large, very egalitarian increase in funding going to retirees, right, that wouldn't show up in measures like the ones you've got here, but it would very much show up on the consumption side. On the other hand, things like the ability to provide inheritances or gifts for down payments or things like that don't come with that access to a flow of Social Security. You don't have the ability to, in some sense, use your wealth in any way other than that it provides a stream of consumption over time. And so how do we think about whether those types of the Social Security type flows belong in here? Certainly when people capitalize them and include them in the US context, you see very large switches in how much inequality you're seeing. But it feels like it is, in some sense, measuring something slightly different. So I'm just curious how you see it and why you're making the choices you are.
So we're making the choice to not include it, exactly as you said, because you cannot sell it. So we wanted to focus on assets that you can trade on the market and get rid of if you need the money. But of course, it's extremely interesting to understand the different impact that the systems have over time. So, for example, countries like Germany reduce their, so the Social Security pensions that I will probably receive are probably lower than what my parents receive. So, and this is really present in the public discussion. So particularly high income individuals save much more these days in private retirement schemes in Germany than they did before. And if you look at the financial aggregates, as Alice mentioned, this is increasing over time. And this is also happening across countries. So Daniel Waldenström from Uppsala, from Stockholm, has a new paper where I think it's called Capital and History, where he decomposes wealth income ratios over time by housing and retirement. And he can show that retirement assets, pension assets, are an increasing share of wealth income ratios in recent times. So if we look at increasing wealth income ratios, it's not just that capital owners get more richer, like firm owners, but also like broad parts of the population are enriched because of more retirement savings and housing. But then these retirement savings are probably made, or we can observe that it's more disproportionately done by the upper half or the richer half, the richer people. And also for the case of Social Security pensions, they benefit more. So there are papers around for the US, but also for Germany, that there is a huge gap in mortality across income classes. So if you compute lifetime income, including these potential Social Security pensions, I have some colleagues in Berlin who are currently finalizing such a paper, we see a large gap between high income people and low income people. So it does not universally in one direction close the wealth gap if you contribute that, if you complement that and take a lifetime perspective. So yeah, and this makes things really complicated, I think. So.
Trevor or Alice, anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way, so I've done work estimating Social Security wealth for households, and also estimating kind of the defined benefit pension, since that's a big piece for a lot of households. I think, to me, the way I think about it, it's like, it depends on the question I want to answer, right? Sometimes we want to think about market wealth and what I can liquidate tomorrow. But at the same time, when I want to think about well-being of households, and especially when I want to, Jay's question sort of triggered in my mind thinking about kind of old age well-being over time and history, and how to think about, were people using their wealth to fund retirement in the 40s, or was it, they were just working until they died, right? So the motive for savings has changed over time. And again, sort of what are those questions, and how do we, depending on how we view it, it depends on how maybe we are interpreting inequality. So I think that, and yeah, so I think for me, it depends on the question, but I think that the historical piece is kind of a really new dimension for me to think about. It's interesting.
Great. Just trying to read over to a question that came in. I can get to it. Someone tried to signal me there's a question, but I'm not seeing it. So, so if the person who signaled me that way said, please see my question in the chat, I'm not actually seeing a question in the chat. So if you'd like to ask it in the Q&A, I'll try to look at it there. The other thing that did occur to me when you were talking about the higher saving in the middle class, and that was in some sense holding off inequality in some ways, right? Because it meant that that the middle class was continuing to accumulate assets. Is that in the narrative in the United States, often it's when there was, I don't want to say income stagnation at the middle, because it's not necessarily stagnation depending how you're measuring it, but slower income growth at the middle than at the top. That one way to prevent consumption inequality from growing was for less saving at the middle and increased borrowing at the middle to finance consumption, to avoid kind of a growing consumption inequality. And so what you're describing, though, if the rich are getting lots of capital gains and the middle class are doing a lot of savings, that feels like, in some sense, it suggests more consumption inequality, if not wealth inequality. And so I'm just curious how that plays in, and how that, in some sense, operates in a society. If, yes, people are preventing the wealth inequality, but they're not seeing growing consumption.
Thanks so much. This is a really great point. So we actually do see quite stable consumption inequality in Germany since the 90s, or even declining, but maybe that's not the most interesting aspect of your question, because I really think that this is now coming to the main difference between the two countries, the US and Germany. So the growth in the US is really consumer driven, right? So the US society is really about increasing consumption of the population, and that you can take on a debt on your house to fund your consumption. And the German growth model is really export oriented, and we need the consumption of everybody else. So, and also the housing market is constructed in a way like this. A colleague of mine at Harvard is working on this, that even unions were interested in keeping rents low in Germany so that you could keep wages low, so that the competitive advantage of the German industry would remain in international comparison. So I think it's Germans are very less about consumption in general than about savings, and they like to save a lot. That's really present in society, and as soon as they are able to get a house, they will save through their house, because then they don't have to worry about any portfolio choices anymore. So I think this is really present, the present narrative in German middle classes, that one should build a reasonable amount of wealth through their house, and consumption is much less of importance. Also, to some degree, worrying economic policymakers every now and then, and also in the European context, increasingly Germany being exclusively blamed for this model of taking their growth on the consumption of the world. But yeah.
So can I just have a quick follow-up question, Jay, before you get, sorry. So that to me says if all they're doing is saving through their house, right? I mean, the US literature, I don't know if there's been German studies, people don't downsize so that they can spend their housing wealth in retirement. So is it really that they don't ever plan on spending any of the equity in the house? They're really just going to give it to their kids? Like, is that sort of that's the common story? They're never, this is just saving for the sake of savings and not actually to fund consumption.
And also, well, also maybe to enable higher consumption during retirement. So it's really present in the debate that then you don't have to pay rent when you're retired. Yeah, and it's really expensive to buy a house in Germany. You have the additional fees are like 15% of the price. So 6% is just in taxes. So this is crazy what you have to transfer to the financial authorities when you buy a house. So it's not that people think about buying a house and then selling it. It's really buying it forever.
So,
and I think it's a big problem for the German housing market that a lot of old people are living in large houses and they're not thinking to sell it because it would be just so expensive to buy a smaller house. And they will lose this 15% by buying this new house, and the prices have increased so substantially. Yeah, so it's really these gains that we're talking about for the middle class is nothing that they can actually cash in. It's only for those who have additional houses and want to reallocate from one city to the other, and not move, like only reallocate the rental housing assets.
Interesting. So one last question that just came in over the Q&A is thinking about the inequality by gender. So they're pointing out that during the occupation, occupiers paid women less. That's perhaps contributed to the fact that Germany still has a fairly sizable gender pay gap. And so to what extent did you look at, and maybe you haven't been able to yet, or it's something coming, look at the wealth inequality depending, for example, on, you know, gender of head of household or things like that?
Thank you so much for allowing me to pitch a new paper. I'm actually working on a gender wealth gap paper with Eva Zieminska, who's kind of the gender wealth gap woman in Europe. And the sub-data have individual wealth data, so we can look at female and male wealth independent of their household context. And so this is really work in progress, but what I think what is most interesting of what we find now is that the gender wealth gap is really most pronounced at the very top. So like the median of the distribution, if you rank males and females by their wealth, not so different. But at the top, it's really, really, really high because men have more wealth in businesses and more wealth in renting housing, whereas primary residence is more the important asset for women. And what I also find interesting is life cycle profiles. So it seems that men who are more engaged in the labor market accumulate more wealth in their 30s and 40s. And then at some point after 60, they die and leave the wealth to their women. So women increase their wealth in retirement because they become widows. So that's, but through all ages, there's this gender wealth gap present. But I found it interesting that there seem to be like systematically different life cycle profiles for men and women.
Great, thank you. And it's good to look forward to new work as a way to close out a very, very interesting seminar. So thank you, Charlotte. Thank you very much, Alice and Trevor, for your contributions. Thanks to all of you for joining in. And please do continue checking the website and watching for further Facing Inequality events. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.